Hello, I am this guy, and today I want to tell you about a game that I think truly captures the spirit of adventure, and why. Now you may think that sounds pretty subjective, and it is, but if you've played a lot of games throughout your life, especially single-player focused ones, with a beginning, middle, and an ending, then you know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about those games that you keep thinking of long after beating them, wishing they were longer, or that you could develop amnesia, like these guys did, am I right? Just so you could experience them for the first time again. So I'm gonna use my knowledge of games, design, and game design to pick out a few concrete examples of gameplay features and design elements, and argue for why I think they give the game that sense of adventure that's often so hard to define. I actually meant to include at least 4 or 5 games in this video, but I severely underestimated how much I have to say about each one. Therefore, I'm making this video entirely about one of my favorite games, in one of my favorite genres, the late 90s PC shooter, Unreal. The only other thing I'm gonna add to this preamble before jumping into it is a minor spoiler warning. I won't be showing you major plot twists or giving away the ending or anything, but I will obviously bring up examples from the setting and plot. So if you're like me and you enjoy going into games as blindly as possible, and you've really been meaning to check out Unreal, then pause the video and go play it. If you can get a hold of a copy, that is. More on that later. With that said, vegans beware, because here come the meat and potatoes. Unreal is not only one of my favorite games, but it's also the first example I thought to use for this topic, since it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly it is that makes it so special to me. I'll put it like this: if I were to just make a bullet point list of all of the game's strengths and weaknesses, then I could have just as well made this video about the first Half-Life game instead. I'd even argue that Half-Life is better when it comes to most or all of those bullet points. But despite how similar these games are on paper, Unreal has a very different atmosphere and vibe to it that sets it apart from Half-Life. And it's because of this vibe, as I will explain, that I would consider Unreal the more adventurous game of the two. So to sum up the game's history real quick, it's a late 90s FPS game, released just a few months before Half-Life in fact. It was developed by Epic Mega Games, or simply Epic Games as they're known today. You may know them as the creators of Unreal Engine, and if you don't know them as the creators of Unreal Engine, you may know them as the creators of Fortnite. Now, Unreal wasn't unsuccessful by any means, but the reason I think people don't talk about it very often in terms of story and setting is because of its more popular sequel, Unreal Tournament. While Unreal Tournament technically takes place in the same universe as Unreal, it's an entirely multiplayer-oriented game, with a pretty bare-bones plot that mostly serves to justify throwing a bunch of cool characters together in cool arenas, and have them blow each other to veritable smithereens. And this proved so popular that from then on, the Unreal franchise had become the Unreal Tournament franchise. Except for one 2003 entry that didn't receive much acclaim, every game in the series since has been about multiplayer arena combat. And it's a ton of fun, but it's not, well, this. This, my dear viewers and currently rewinding listeners, is Napali, or Napali maybe. Despite what Google insists that I'm referring to, it is not the Napali Coast State Wilderness Park in the US-occupied Kingdom of Hawaii, but rather, it is a strange and dangerous but also breathtakingly beautiful planet full of wonder and mystery, and, of course, adventure. Actually, that might describe the Napali Coast State Wilderness Park as well. I've never been, and I doubt I ever will. To me, the planet of Napali itself is the real star of the show in this game, and I get the feeling that the designers thought the same way. The late 90s was a time of extremely rapid development in computer graphics and computers in general, and it was at this time that it was suddenly becoming possible to make fully three-dimensional games for home computers. Of course, 3D modeling wasn't a new concept in itself, but it had mostly been reserved for movies and TV, since it took a long time to render 3D animation back then. Games trying to render 3D objects in real time were stuck with extremely primitive geometry because of this reason, and in order to produce something that didn't look like stale vomit, some developers would mix 3D and 2D elements to reduce the strain on the computer, or simply not bother with 3D games at all. However, when id Software released Quake in 1996, the goal of all their competitors shifted from "let's see how many low-effort Doom clones we can make in a year" to "let's give people vertigo." Now everyone wanted to be the most 3D game, and the designers at Epic Bacon Mega Games took that philosophy to its logical conclusion. They said, let's just make the coolest looking screenshots we can and send them to all the gaming mags, and then we'll figure out what the game is about afterwards. Famously, one of the first prototypes had the main character wearing some medieval-looking armor, and featured wizards, gargoyles, and dragons, for example. And in my opinion, in the case of Unreal, that strategy was totally the right move. When you're playing, you can tell that each environment is designed to make you go, whoa, and ooh, and wait, how big is this game? Whenever you're outdoors, the level designers make sure to put you in a spot where you can see about as far into the distance as the engine allows, and then they throw in as many visual effects as they can without blowing your computer up. Furthermore, I suspect that some of the fantasy flair from the prototypes actually stuck around into the final game, and that's why you have very medieval-looking castles and forts and other buildings on Napali that create an interesting contrast next to the more sci-fi architecture brought by its various visitors. This is also when I want to mention something I call the squint test. If Gandalf the Low Poly was to approach you in this moment and ask, "What do your gamer eyes see?" you would reply, "They see a landscape made up of like 10 polygons and a low-res 2D image of a sky and some mountains." And you'd be right, of course, because that's what it is. But now try squinting a bit, or standing further away from the screen, or smearing it with Vaseline or something. And more importantly, try to imagine that this is the first time you're seeing graphics this good. Suddenly, you're no longer seeing those flat rock textures, or rather, you're not seeing them as flat, because you don't have bump-mapped 10K polygon megascans to compare them with. It's not that those flat rock walls looked more detailed back then, but they looked more realistic than anything you had seen before. And that's the mental state I want you to try to put yourself in when doing the squint test. In the back of your mind, you know that those mountains in the distance aren't part of the landscape, and that the map probably cuts off right past the top of the cliffs, but you're not thinking about any of that. Because again, this is by far the largest and most detailed world you've ever navigated in 3D before. Not to mention that it's still the 90s and you haven't watched Boundary Break because YouTube doesn't exist yet. So unless you've actually personally worked with 3D game engines, the possibilities of what these developers can do seem pretty much endless. Anyway, my point is that every area in this game is almost like a tech demo, in that they were designed to awe you. And awe you they do. Or at least they awed me, even though the first time I played it was only like 5 years ago. And I'm not just talking about every area as in every level, but practically every single room. In level design, there are lots of little tricks you can use to make a section of a level unique, like switching up the color and intensity of the lighting, playing with the height and shape of the ceilings and walls, varying the textures and adding unique visual elements, like water features, foliage, windows of different shapes and sizes, animated background objects like torches and fireplaces and electronics and so on, and Unreal covers them all. Eventually, as you start to realize that every new level is going to try to impress you with something you haven't seen before, it makes you want to push forward even more, just to see what they'll come up with next. And this, to me, is a key part of any adventure. If you know what to expect around every corner, then you're not adventuring, you're just commuting. I don't want to give away the entire journey, but a few of my favorite examples of these wow moments include the approach to this enormous spaceship, this remote mountain monastery, this immense natural rock spire that has been hollowed out and made into a fortress, and this giant arena, and this castle, of course. And even though I'm more of an ass man personally, I can't forget about this temple. I figured I'll lose all my gamer cred if I make a video about the environments in Unreal and don't include the Temple of Lady Fourboobs. By far my favorite moment in the entire game though, and I'm gonna need you to hear the soundtrack for this one, is here. Right after traveling up a mysterious elevator and making your way through a short cave passage, you emerge out of the side of a mountain and see this. And the best part is that this is only about halfway through the game. In many games, when you reach the floating city in the sky, that's usually a sign that you're nearing the end. But Unreal has so many more sights to show you that when you're done, it really feels like you've traveled across pretty much an entire planet. So how is any of what I just said similar to Half-Life? Well, it isn't, which is why this was the point I wanted to spend the most time on. Half-Life, as brilliantly designed as it is, famously has you spending a lot of time in dark, cramped air vents. And most of the dingy, industrial concrete corridors also have a tendency to blend together after a while. Unreal, in contrast, is a globe-trotting trek across jungles, swamps, canyons, and harsh mountains. And that's what I meant when I said that this game has a totally different atmosphere. With that said, let's get to those aspects that it does share with Half-Life, because without them, this would just be me talking about how pretty the game is. After all, simply looking at a bunch of cool places isn't an adventure, even if they're unlike anything you've ever seen before. That's just called sightseeing. Adventure, to me, isn't just about what you're experiencing, but also how you're experiencing it. First and foremost, Epic decided to break from the level-by-level style of game progression that was the norm at the time. There's no level select menu, no mission briefings, no text crawls or cutscenes. Instead, the designers opted for a more immersive, say it with me gaming video essay enthusiasts, unbroken first-person perspective. And again, when I say that this is just like in Half-Life, keep in mind that this game was released before Half-Life. So this was not a follow-the-leader situation, but rather a bold and innovative design choice that hadn't yet been seen in 100 other games before.
Prisoners 849 escaping.
From the moment you start the game to the moment the credits start to roll, you're watching the story entirely through the eyes of Prisoner 849. There are no automated sequences, no time skips, and no fade to black doors or other transitions. If you find yourself on a long elevator or vehicle ride, you're seeing the whole thing. And they're not gonna stop you from jumping off either. So if you're one of those players who always has to see if you're allowed to fuck up in stupid places, the answer is yes. You're not gonna see a lot of non-diegetic stuff either for that matter, no floating arrows or damage numbers, and the UI is kept pretty minimal so as to not be distracting. Interestingly enough, the one exception to this focus on immersiveness happens at the same time as it does in Half-Life. That is, when the game is loading the next map. Unlike Half-Life though, Unreal doesn't seem to do it out of necessity. Half-Life writes loading on the screen between each map, presumably to let the players know that the game didn't just crash. But Unreal, for whatever reason, doesn't show any text during the actual loading. Instead, once the new map is loaded, the game briefly displays its name, as well as the name of the person who created it. Now, as a level designer myself, I can't deny that this is actually very flattering, because it's not something you see very often in any type of game. For the sake of uninterrupted immersion though, my hypothetical perfect remaster of this game would probably include the option to turn this text off. Furthermore, just like in Half-Life, your character is entirely mute, and the pacing of the game is such that you end up spending a lot of time alone, far away from any friendly characters. Therefore, it feels like a nice breather whenever you run into any of the locals, known as the Nali, even though they understandably don't speak any English. Och inte någon svenska heller för den delen. These moments are like the rest stops during a long road trip. And in general, the pacing in Unreal is excellently balanced between these highs and lows. Moments of high tension are followed by appropriately timed breaks, and the scenery always changes at the same pace. Just when you've had enough of claustrophobic temple hallways, you suddenly emerge onto a big open field, with sparkling waterfalls and chirping birds. And just when you're beginning to get exhausted from a long combat segment, the game lets up on the intensity for a while, and gives you a section that's mostly about exploring, with only a few weak enemies here and there to keep you on your toes. Again, just like in Half-Life. These sections even have a stationary enemy that hangs from ceilings, just like Half-Life's barnacles. They're little more than annoyances, but their existence alone encourages you to always look in all directions when exploring, instead of just left and right. I don't know if that's their intended purpose, or just me overanalyzing, but it's a nice game design lesson either way. Even today, many games severely underutilize verticality in their gameplay and level design. In fact, I have another little experiment for you to try. Go outside and find a location such as a bridge or a cliff, or anywhere else where you can stand and look down on people from above. Most likely, in my experience, not a single person will notice you. And maybe some of them are just pretending not to notice because they think you're weird. But my conclusion is still that most people simply don't pay attention to stuff that's happening above them. Use this knowledge at your discretion. As for the game's story, most of it is told through electronic logbooks found near the corpses of other humans, who also ended up stranded on the planet for various reasons. While I feel like this style of storytelling can really drag the pace down in some games, especially action games, the logs are never longer than a paragraph, and they're placed sparingly enough that I didn't have an issue with it. Plus, it helps that the story is somewhat more complex compared to many similar sci-fi stories. At least it was interesting enough to keep me wanting to know more when I first played the game. At its core, the plot is the usual space colonizers versus technologically inferior native population. But unlike something like Avatar, there are actually several different factions, all with different goals and reasons for their presence on the planet. Some of them were brought there by other forces as slaves or mercenaries, and others are hostile to everyone else and seem to have their own agenda entirely. And while the humans are partaking in space colonization on other planets, that's not actually the reason they ended up on Napali. Additionally, the native population isn't a total monoculture either. Some are warrior civilizations, as evidenced by their fortresses and gladiatorial arenas, while others, like the Nali, are primarily pacifists. And even among the Nali themselves, there seem to be several different viewpoints and beliefs, including debates on interpretations of religious prophecies, and several of the Nali you meet will actually guide you to their secret weapon stashes that they have, despite being pacifists. So to sum things up, why exactly do I feel like Unreal is such a great example of a game that really captures the spirit of adventure? From a gameplay perspective, as I explained with my Half-Life comparisons, the game does everything it can to keep you alert and immersed in the world by keeping distractions to a minimum. From beginning to end, you are Prisoner 849, and you get to see everything she sees, in order, with no time skips or cinematics. And while the overarching game flow is linear and primarily action-focused, it's not just a series of labyrinths crammed full of enemies, as had been the norm in the previous generation of FPS games. Instead, it's a varied and unpredictable journey that has you slowly trekking through the jungle collecting health fruits one moment, and storming guns blazing through a high-tech alien base the next. In terms of narrative, art direction, and world building, things get even more subjective, of course. But to me, this aspect does a lot of the heavy lifting that takes Unreal from being a cool game to being an experience. In my opinion, a memorable journey is one that takes you through many different moods and emotions, and this, I feel, is definitely true of Unreal. Is it a horror game? No, but there are certainly creepy sections. It's not an exploration game, but there are still many large open areas, where you can spend a lot of time poking around for secrets. And while I wouldn't exactly describe the story as lighthearted, there are a few logbooks here and there that might catch you off guard with their edgy 90s humor. Now, I'd like to end this video by saying that if this sounds like your cup of tea, you should go buy the game right now. But unfortunately, you can't. In 2022, Epic randomly decided to remove Unreal and a bunch of other old games from all digital storefronts. Supposedly it was because of network security concerns or something, which feels like something you don't want to hear from the guys who make Fortnite. I suspect that what they really meant is, no one who still works here even knows how to host an Unreal multiplayer server, and we'd look incompetent if we told players to just figure it out themselves, so we're just gonna pretend that those old games don't exist. Of course, whenever a big company abandons a beloved game, the fans step in to preserve it, and often with more effort put into the process than the company ever did itself. So again, I can't tell you to buy the game, since you can't. But if a copy of Unreal were to somehow just appear on your computer from who knows where, I highly recommend playing it. Not before downloading and applying the community patch though, as it fixes a ton of minor bugs, and makes the game much more compatible with modern systems. Because as someone who actually bought the game legally from Steam before it was removed, trust me, you'll definitely want the option to increase the UI size, unless you love sitting at your computer like this. And that about wraps it up. As I said in the beginning, I originally thought I'd be including multiple games in this video, but I keep forgetting how much I love talking about game design, so I'm thinking about making this into a series instead. If that's something you'd be interested in, let me know in the comments. And don't forget to do all those other things that YouTubers always ask you to do at the end of videos. Oh, and one more thing. I haven't actually been using Unreal's original soundtrack in this video, but rather remastered versions by an artist called Mothership Loudspeakers. Personally, I think they're some of the best soundtrack remasters I've heard, so it would have felt like a sin not to include them. Additionally, I've also been kindly allowed to borrow some gameplay footage from a couple of long play channels, so I want to give a big thank you to these channels, all of which can be found in the description, of course. That's it, farewell!